Welcome here. We appreciate you all coming to the GRC Summit. I'm glad to see you all here with us as well. This panel will be about structured anti-corruption programs in a dynamic and distributed business. So we look forward, we have a couple experts here with us. We'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. I'm Matt Tolson. I've been with MetricStream for 5 years, a director of GRC Solutions, and I'm here with Kris Rossfeld, Senior Director and Assistant General Counsel of Privacy, Anticorruption, and Antitrust at Western Digital, and also Hollie Foust, SVP of Ethics and Compliance at Cardinal Health. Before we get into the questions, Hollie, would you like to just introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about you and Cardinal Health?
Okay, yeah. So again, my name is Hollie Foust. I'm in charge of Ethics and Compliance, Business Continuity, and Enterprise Risk Management at Cardinal Health. I've been with Cardinal Health for 9 years now. Cardinal Health is a $100 billion company with 50,000 employees worldwide. We distribute pharmaceutical products throughout the United States, and we manufacture medical device products throughout the world, and we distribute medical device products within the United States as well. We provide a variety of pharmacy services and solutions to hospitals, acute care settings, and we supply into every market from the acute care through to the home care. Those are our customers.
Thank you, Hollie. And Kris, could you take a moment just to introduce yourselves before we get moving?
Sure. First, thank you for braving the late afternoon session on anti-corruption. I'm sure you guys were all most excited about this one for sure. So I think hopefully most of you were in the last session, so you know a little bit about what we are. We are the largest electronic storage device manufacturer in the world. What I didn't mention before was we're essentially in almost every country doing something somewhere throughout the world. We obviously sell devices. Some of the brands obviously are Western Digital, also HGST and SanDisk. Those are the brands that we sell. So those might be some of the devices that you've seen before. We're about 70,000, 80,000 employees now throughout the world, about 20 billion in revenue, and look forward to this panel. So we know sort of the level of to speak at today, just by show of hands, how many of you manage anti-corruption or are otherwise involved in sort of anti-corruption audits or those types of things? All right, so about a quarter to a half of you. So, all right, we'll try to kind of balance all of that and not bore the experts and also not speak above the rest. So we'll try to manage that as we go.
So, I mean, as this session is focused on anti-corruption programs, and we have probably a diverse group of folks in the audience, and we have a couple diverse speakers with different backgrounds too as well on this. Can you spend just a moment discussing some anti-corruption laws, generally speaking?
Yeah. Here's a very basic law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Many people are familiar with this law, but I don't want to assume anything. But the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a law that prohibits bribing foreign officials. So if you're a U.S. company and you are doing business overseas, you cannot either directly or indirectly bribe foreign officials. And if you're a public company, you're also required under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to have accurate books and records. There is a misbelief sometimes that the FCPA does not apply to private companies. That's not true. It does, and its reach is very extensive. And then we're going to go to the next slide. In addition to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, many countries have their own anti-bribery and anti-corruption laws. In addition, even in the United States itself, there is state anti-bribery laws. And if the government is unable to prosecute you under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it's going to explore money laundering, the Travel Act. There's many different theories they're going to go to try to catch you and prosecute you if you either directly or indirectly bribe individuals to get business. Any questions on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? Okay, that's all I was going to say.
Oh, thanks, Hollie. So Kris, given that background, government compliance programs are often trying to locate and prevent people from committing a bribe. Could you provide some overview of where to look?
Sure. So I'm going to break our policy and stand up a little, mostly because it's the end of the day and partially because I'm not feeling well, and it helps to stand up a little bit. So we're talking about corruption, and hopefully a lot of you have had some experience with these types of programs. Hopefully if you're not right now managing them, you've been trained on them by now. And we thought it'd be helpful just to give you a little bit of an idea about where companies look for these types of things. And the reason is there's been a long history of corruption in international business. And you know, our jobs, her job, my job, are at companies trying to prevent it, trying to get people to do the right thing, and one of the best ways to start with that is just simply knowing where to look. So it might surprise some of you to know 90 to 95% of corruption cases involve some form of a third party. Very few companies, hopefully companies nowadays, most public companies have pretty good controls internally, so it's pretty hard to get a bribe approved. Believe it or not, it does happen. So sometimes that's why there's that 5 to 10%. But for the most part, they have to take it off the books and they have to do it some way. And how do they do it? They do it with third parties. So if you've ever heard one of your anti-corruption experts talk about due diligence of third parties, analyzing third parties, finding out what distributors are doing, making sure that we're dealing with reputable distributors, that's why. Because very common in the anti-corruption space, people are using distributors, people are using consultants, people are using some form of a third party they're trying to do it. Now, how do they do it? You deal with a consultant and you want to have them go pay a bribe for you. You don't typically put in the SOW, go pay bribe. What you do is you put in the SOW either very little or you put in some form of sort of very generalized practice, like offering consulting services for Donald Trump or something like that, and then there you have it. So that's, by the way, I'm not political, I'm not going to talk about Trump. That wasn't meant derogatory toward him. I'll say the same thing about Obama. If it said the same thing about Obama, the same thing. But what you do and what you have to do if you're in a control area is look at the agreements. Make sure that the agreements are detailed. Make sure we understand what they're doing. Because if a regulator comes in and that consultant paid a bribe and all they have is a piece of paper that says consulting services, they're going to look at you and think that you knew what you were doing and you knew what they were doing. Because in today's day and age now, they are not comfortable with allowing companies to just allow third parties to go out and operate at their will. And so make sure you're looking at that area. It's a very common area. It's an area where a lot of the corruption is. Another place, very similar, we go down to get cash, gifts, meals, travel, and entertainment. Be very wary of the agents that are managing your travel. If you guys don't have a policy that approves your travel agent and make everybody use that travel agent, in countries throughout the world, travel agents are one of the main areas people funnel gifts, entertainment, trips, and a lot of other places. It's a very important area. It's one that make sure you're monitoring. Most big companies now have a policy through travel entertainment that says you have to use a specific travel agent. That's one of the reasons. There's a lot of other reasons, but that's one of them. But look, in the big picture, third parties are a big part of it, and yet our books and records, your books and records are still a risk. How do they do it? They have vague expense reported. Sometimes it's just pure fraud on the expense reports, but oftentimes they're very vague. So if you're in a finance role or an audit role and you're seeing really vague references to money being spent, make sure you understand what's happening. A lot of times we get busy. A lot of times we just want to move forward. But if you don't understand what a transaction is that you're approving, or your people don't understand that transaction, there's a good chance people are going to make you responsible for it in the end if you don't know what it is. And there's a lot of bribes that still get through the books of very large companies just because people aren't paying attention as they come through as a gift, as an entertainment, or as something else. So pay attention there. There's a lot of other areas, charities. You know, believe it or not, people funnel a lot of money through charities as bribes. You go to a government official, guess what? This wonderful charity that her husband manages is a wonderful place to donate money to. So if you don't have a handle on your charitable contributions, in foreign governments in particular, that's a very high risk area. Make sure you understand where the money's going. And let's not leave our HR folks out of this either. One of very common areas is the hiring of friends of government officials, husbands, wives, mostly kids actually. They want a job. So if you don't have a process to vet even those people coming into your company, knowing who's recommending them, knowing why we're hiring them, making sure that they're qualified people, make sure to check that. There's a number of bribery cases out there where, in fact, people doing no work at all were suddenly hired by a company just to make sure that money was getting funneled to government officials.
Let me just speak real quick on a couple of these. And for those of you who have hypotheticals to share of corruption that you've seen in your company, please speak up. Like, this will be much more interesting if we share stories or cases that you're aware of. So with distributor allowances, how many people in this room work with distributors? A handful. So this has been a high area of corruption where if you're selling product through a distributor, your employees may collude with that distributor to say, hey, I can't directly pay this government tender agent, so I'll just pay you a marketing fee, and you go ahead and we'll book it as a marketing fee, and then you pay that bribe to the government agent. The travel agents, if you read the GSK case, here you'll have collusion with your employees and the travel agent saying, mock up the invoice a little bit higher. The employee takes a little bit. They pay the government official, which, and if you're in healthcare, most institutions outside the United States, most hospitals are owned by the government. And so every person who works in that institution, from the materials manager to the physicians, are government officials. So a travel agent will, outside the United States, it's very common to send physicians to third-party educational conferences. And in the GSK case, it was alleged that the employees were colluding with the travel agent to up the invoice. They would pay for a HCP to go to a conference. The travel agent would arrange for travel of the spouse. It was really just a luxury vacation. And there was a cash payment to the healthcare professional, and the employee got to take a little bit too. Has anybody in the room heard about the General Cable case? So General Cable case was very interesting to me, and I think it's a good study if you guys are trying to understand the government's aggressive nature on Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations. So General Cable was accused of not having appropriate controls in place to prohibit bribery. In the General Cable case, what was fascinating was the CEO and the CFO personally had to repay the CEO over $3 million and the CFO over $2 million because of violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that occurred during the time that they were in those positions with the company. For both of those individuals, it was found that there was no knowledge that the bribery was going on. But for the failure to have controls in place, they had to return the bonus payments they earned on that corrupt behavior during that time. Yes?
So that was a disgorgement?
A disgorgement, correct. They had to disgorge their profits. Yeah. So what was interesting about that case, though, is, and it is a good example of what type of controls you have to put in place. So one of the examples is they had a sales agent in Angola who, according to General Cable's policy, was only supposed to receive a commission of 1%. But if you looked at the actual accounts payable, that sales agent was receiving commissions up to 18%. So a simple way for you guys to monitor whether or not you have corruption issues is to look at the contract and then look at what payments are going to that individual. Any other questions?
Yeah, one last area that I'll talk about too is MDF funds, marketing development funds. A very common sort of risk area. It's a risk area for a number of different things, kickbacks and bribery and other items too. But the reason a fund like an MDF, how many of you guys know if your company uses MDF in their business? Does anybody? So one of the things about marketing is if you can tell me a definition of what is a type of marketing, then you're smarter than me. Because I have found a salesperson can always come up with an excuse for why what they're doing is some form of marketing. And it's always trying to develop something. So what happens with those funds is that if you don't have really strong controls on it, it becomes a type of a slush fund. And they use it anytime they need to make the money at the end of the quarter. They need it anytime they need to win a deal. And by the way, they have no problem spending it wherever they want to. And so it's another area. Make sure that there's some controls around when MDF can be used, how it can be used. Make sure there's some form of approvals in there. Had one gentleman unfortunately lose his job for using MDF funds. Ultimately ended up being a type of a kickback, but for whatever reason he really wanted Rocky Balboa shorts. And so he went to a charity, and sure enough they had Rocky Balboa shorts there. He had the distributor pay the charity out of MDF funds, submitted it, and he got his Rocky Balboa shorts. You know, people do funny things, and best they not do it with your money. So.
Thank you both. I mean, now that we know some places to look, we know some controls, you know, what are different ways in which organizations can structure their anti-bribery and corruption program to proactively mitigate some risks? Is there a magic number of resources that are required for anti-corruption?
Do you want to go to the next slide? I don't think there's a magic number of resources. Obviously, we take a risk-based approach. This is what the government has said over and over again. Take a risk-based approach depending on the size of your corporation. I think it's not just compliance, it's not just finance, it's not internal audit. And it's a group effort within the corporation to monitor the policies and procedures that they have in place and not rely on internal audit to catch it. And so making sure that the company knows that we all have skin in the game. We all want to stop embezzlement and anti-corruption from occurring. But one of the things to think about is the fraud triangle, which is, thinking about what is the motivation for people. And it can be aggressive sales targets, unrealistic sales targets. It can be, just general pressure in the company, that not paying out bonuses year after year because it's been a difficult time. It can be a person's personal situation. Maybe they're going through a divorce or they're struggling financially. Watching for these signals and making sure that you're aware of these risks in heightened times during either your employees' life or in the life of the corporation. The other is the controls environment, obviously. A lot of people will test and see what they can get away with, especially if you're in a situation where you're going through a lot of acquisitions and integration. The systems have not been worked out. Maybe they're on the old, when you acquire a company, they're on the old system. They haven't gone to your system yet. And that is a key opportunity for people to challenge your controls and see if you put anything in place. So it's a high risk area. But if you don't have the appropriate review, oversight, on how money gets out of your company, you have a risk there. And the other is just culture and that rationalization process. I was recently at a compliance conference, and they had the business come out and speak, and it was a vice president of Depew Synthes. And he said, employees really watch everything the executive leadership does. And it's body language when compliance is sitting next to them. It's talking and the way they talk about compliance when they're sitting in a conference or in their staff meetings. Is compliance a joke? Does compliance get followed? And if the senior leadership is not following, even on the little things, and I lecture my senior leadership, we have a meal limit policy because we're in healthcare, and if you're out with a customer and you're blowing through the meal limit and you're ordering excessive amounts of alcohol, then your people think the rules don't apply to them. Another example I give to the senior leadership team is the most senior must pay. So that's a control feature we have. And we watch in compliance when we do monitoring of our T&Es and we see continued violations where the most senior person didn't pay, the message to the rest of the team is these controls don't apply to my department because my senior leader's not doing it. So the rationalization process starts. And people start to rationalize their behavior because, well, my boss doesn't follow it, why do I need to follow it? So you do control a little bit with the fraud triangle on that rationalization process, and it's key to educate the senior leaders on all the little things they do will really drive whether or not you're going to have fraud and corruption in your company.
Can I speak to that? Just so a couple pieces very, very similar. So one, on the point you're just making, Hollie, so most senior person pays. I'll just give you a small little anecdote. A number of years ago, I was investigating a matter, and there were a whole lot of expenses coming in from an assistant and approved by a site manager. And as we looked into it a little bit further, we realized that the site manager and the assistant were having an affair. And the site manager didn't want the fees to show up on his credit card, so what would he do? He would use she would use the company credit card for every time they went out to dinner, and then he would approve. As we looked at it, we kept going further and following the trail a little bit further, and all of a sudden, a band was charged. And then after the band, there were some flowers charged. And sure enough, he had left his wife and they were getting married, and so what were they going to do? They were going to pay for their wedding expenses using the card. Again, she charged it, he approved. So why do we say most senior person pays? Because what happens is if the most senior person doesn't pay, then you're approving it. Now, we want to talk about rationalization. We sat down with them and we said, what were you thinking? And they said, well, after the wedding, we had leftover food and we brought it back to the office and we shared it. So it seemed like a legitimate expense. There is a lot of odd rationalization out there for fraud, and you got to just kind of continue to pay attention. Now, a lot of you are probably in control functions in some form. So we talked about senior leaders, or Hollie talked about senior leaders and the importance of kind of walking the walk. It is even more important that you walk the walk. When they see somebody in a control function disregard a policy or not really pay attention or focus on the real issues, they think they can get away with anything because nobody's watching. I'm going to steal a story and I'm going to take some creative license. I don't know if any of you know Richard B. Strong. He's sort of a leading speaker now in the area. Has not had the best of compliance past. He was actually charged and went to jail, I think, for about 2 years for bribery. Since he's come out, he's become a leading speaker. And we had him come in and talk to our sales team a few years ago. And when he spoke to them, he told us a story. He was selling weapons to international governments. That was his job before he was arrested and charged. And one situation, he flew overseas and was having sort of trouble kind of managing it, but he, in order to sort of make it happen, he found a customer. The customer paid him in cash. So he was sitting in a foreign country with over $60,000 in cash for a recent sale that he had made. Now he's getting on a plane and he's worried about all the customs, so he calls his legal department and he says, hey, I've got $60,000 in cash here, how do I get it back to the US? Now rather than saying, why the heck do you have $60,000 in cash? What were you thinking? About 5 minutes later, the lawyer called him back and said, okay, here's how you get it back in the country. When you land, you're going to go here, and then you're going to do that, and then you're going to do this, and then you're going to get it into the country. He said from then on, he knew that he could do whatever he wants in terms of bribery, and it just sort of took his career path toward taking the easy way out. So if our controls aren't, if our legal department, beyond your just compliance rules, but the lawyers in the department, the auditors, the finance teams. None of us like to say no, but we have to say no sometimes. But more important than that, we have to ask questions. And when we do, that triggers the controls that we work so hard to create.
Yeah, I would have to agree. So I've been working with Richard B. Strong as well lately, and I've had him speak to a number of our teams. And one of the stories that I like that Richard talks about is that subtle transfer of loyalty from your company to a third party. So he talks about how he sold his military defense products through distributors, and how that distributor one day said, hey, I know that you're in this country by yourself, me and my family are going out to this great resort, come be my guest. And he didn't have anything going on that weekend, so he went with that distributor, and they spent the whole weekend together. The distributor paid for everything, paid for his hotel, paid for his food, and how he knew at that moment there was a little subtle shift in that relationship and his loyalty because he had received something. So there's an interesting theory about reciprocity and how, there's been studies on how we as humans, regardless of what culture you're in, feel the need to reciprocate when someone gives something to you. So think about it. You're walking down the hall, somebody smiles and says hello. The natural reaction is to say, hey, how are you doing? To respond. There was a professor at Brigham Young University in the 1970s who did a study where he sent 600 Christmas cards, these letters where you talk about your family, to 600 people he didn't know. And he wanted to see how many people would send him a Christmas card back. And 200 people responded with another Christmas card. So they sent them a Christmas card not knowing who he was, but the desire to give back to somebody who gave you something was there. So knowing that reciprocity is there and thinking about your conflict of interest policy and your vendor policy. So, Richard talks about how that loyalty shifted, and when that distributor came up to him, about a year later and said, hey, I know you're entitled to take a price increase, but could you hold off this year? He decided not to take the price increase. He didn't discuss it with his manager, and one could argue, was that ethical? Was that illegal? It probably wasn't illegal, but probably unethical. Well, then the next year, the distributor came back and said, I know I asked you last year to not take a price increase. I really could use your help not taking a price increase this year, and I'll tell you what, I'll give you a little something for doing that. And then, Richard always talks about how these subtle changes of how he was measuring his behavior against the behavior he had in the act he last did. So it's thinking about your vendor code of conduct and explaining why you have that vendor code of conduct is because we want to keep our employees loyal to the company and not loyal to the vendors that provide our services. Any stories or comments or questions? Yeah.
How do you, in some countries, especially in the emerging markets, corruption is systemic and you can't do business without, maybe small crimes without official. I think that's where FCPA and UKPA are different.
Yeah.
In terms of facilitation thing.
I'm sorry, you said the FCPA and what?
The UKPA.
Oh, UK Anti-Bribery Act, yeah.
Yeah. So how does one in this situation with new and stricter regulations deal with operating companies? Well,
it is not a one-hit wonder, right? Like you have to go about it in very different aspects. So one, if you're a US company, you just can't bribe. You just can't do it, right? So one of the things I think is important to do is make sure that understanding is with your country managers and leaders in those regions. And if you do not physically go there, look them in the eye and say, we don't bribe in this company. There may be a misunderstanding that the fact that you've never raised this issue, you've never come to them to talk about it, is that you want me to do business the way business is done here. And so it's very important that we physically get outside of our offices and go to those regions and make it very clear that we do not want you to jeopardize the entire organization for sales in whatever emerging market you're in. So I think that's one thing. I also think making sure you have a true succession plan and expat rotation is very important. Like I would say, we need people who bleed Cardinal red to go into these emerging markets. And once you shift chairs to the left, or you bring in somebody from corporate, there's going to be a lot of noise about that. But it's important to listen to the noise. And it's okay to shift things around because that's when the stuff comes out of the woodwork. And so it's very important to have a true expat rotation program, to be moving people outside of their jobs. A lot of times we just caught an embezzlement situation at Cardinal Health involving iTunes gift cards. And the reason we caught it is because the girl took a day off. And when she took the day off, the person called her manager and said, I don't understand why I have this fee on my budget. And the manager was like, oh, well, before that day off, she was just like, oh, I'm sorry, that's a mistake, and she moved it to another budget. So it's very important that you're forcing employees to take their vacation times, that you have expat rotations, that you are physically, verbally giving that message, and then obviously your controls.
And I'll just add, and maybe it's easier for the lawyer to say, but you can do business in those countries without paying bribes. I think the problem is as soon as you do pay that first one, then you're right, you can, because they expect it and they demand it. But as long as you go in, and especially if you're a large US company, it's just actually quite easy. What's hard is paying that first one and then dialing it back. And so what you can do as a US company, very easily you just go in very firm, very strong from the first day. And sometimes you need an expat. There's lots of people in those countries, most countries, who feel very passionate about cleaning it up in their country. And what I see sometimes a danger in an expats versus local is sometimes expats don't appreciate that a bribe's happening around them in a particular country because they don't know the culture well enough. And I'll give you an example. So before I worked where I work now, I worked for a large agricultural firm. And if you've ever dealt in agriculture, they have a get her done thing, right? And so what I had was a situation where I went down to Brazil. And I had a great relationship with the folks, was doing a big training in a room of a few hundred people in Brazil. And I put up a hypothetical, and the hypothetical was, your boss calls and says, you know, there's a delay, but I just need you to get her done. And I had a young gentleman raise his hand and he said, Kris, nobody would ever say that to me. And I said, that's funny, I just got off a call 5 minutes ago and somebody told me to get her done, so I'm surprised you'd never be told that. And they said, well, yeah, because as soon as they say get her done in Brazil, they mean pay a bribe. And that's the interpretation of the culture. And so if your executives and your people don't understand that when they're communicating across cultures, they have to change their dialogue. They have to be more explicit about not doing things that for them they might take for granted. There's not a single person in the company that I used to work for that I believe would intentionally tell somebody to pay a bribe. But they absolutely would say get her done to somebody in Brazil or Argentina or anywhere else. And if you're not communicating to your people, your senior leadership isn't communicating with the compliance messages that Hollie discussed, good, innocent people who think they're just helping their company and think that's the way they do business out there, very well could get into trouble, and our executives don't want to be the ones that get others in trouble.
Then I agree with you, a great point. I'll add to that, it's also important to know what the bribe language is in the country that you're operating. Not where I work now, but a previous employer. I was on site, I was in China, and I kept seeing all these receipts coming through for something called Baijiu. And Baijiu, for those of you who don't know, is the Chinese version of Everclear. In fact, college. It's sold in these very fancy bottles with gold leaf that may be surrounded by 6 cell phones in a beautiful silk box. And so I'm there, and I'm walking literally through the town of Cathay with the local manager, and there's a giant store full of Baijiu. He said, geez, why is Baijiu so popular? It tastes horrible. It smells like, rubbing alcohol on your hands. And he said, well, that's not a store. That's an exchange. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when the government official gets a box of Baijiu, they bring it into the exchange to get cash. And so it had become a form of currency in this particular part of China. But if you're not there and you're not talking with your people in their language, you just see, Baijiu, and you think, oh, okay, that must be an office supply. I mean, you have no idea that it's obtained a secondary market value.
It's
exactly right.
tea in China too. That was the other thing. Tea. It's like, really? Tea?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's all kinds of
Yeah, how they box it up. Yeah.
Look for quotes around words and expense reports. Karaoke. is one.
Foot massages,
Foot
that's what we
massages, exactly. So there is, but that goes back to, I think we talked about in the other session, but talked about and should be talked about a lot. You got to know your people and got to know your business. And if you're not out there understanding that and you're spending all your time on just data, don't get me wrong. I'm a big believer in data and I'm a big believer in reports and understanding and having processes around it. But if you don't fundamentally understand who your people are, what they're trying to accomplish, and what cultures they operate in, you're missing a whole big part of the risk. In fact, I'd argue the bigger part. So get out there, exactly as you said.
And another comment on the emerging market question, it's really important that your leadership understand that when they set their sales targets, they have to not set it to the market, right? They have to look at, okay, to sell as the competitors and the locals sell in that market, you have to participate in that behavior. So we're not going to do that. So we got to lower our sales target because we're not going to be able to sell like our local competitors do. And so it's very important that they modify their sales targets so that they're not miscommunicating to the sales reps what they expect of them. Yeah.
Just building on this question, I think it's important to clarify between the FCPA and the UKBA.
Yeah.
The UKBA is stricter. The FCPA does allow facilitating payments, which the UKBA considers private.
Yeah.
Right? Plus, the FCPA is targeted towards government officials. The FCPA does that. The UKBA is anyone.
Yep.
Right? So there are scenarios where you arrive at an emerging market situation where on the one it will be okay, on the other it's not.
Right.
Another thing to consider is a lot of commercial people, they're notorious for trying to circumvent controls. They're aware of your private policy and all that, right? They'll spend their own money from their pocket to build on the sales target you just mentioned.
Yes.
To get that. They'll
Yes.
spend their own money. It's
Yeah.
like, listen, go through your system so you can mine all the data you want.
Exactly.
They're not picking it up because they're not spending company money. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's probably something to look at.
It's very important in your training to address that. So on the nuances between the FCPA and the UK Anti-Bribery Act, I basically don't get into that with the salespeople. I don't want them making the judgment call, is that a government official or not a government official? We don't bribe people for business, this is the bottom line. You don't want to get too technical when you do this training, otherwise they're going to just take and hear what they want to hear. And the way the government in the United States defines what is a government official is very broad, and a lot of people would never think that that individual would constitute a government official, but because they work for instrumentality of the government, they can be found to be that. But when I train, especially since we're in healthcare, we really stress and give the example of, for again, healthcare, we're highly regulated, so meal limits are regulated, and so we say you cannot buy the bottle of wine out of your own pocket and pay for it. It's still a violation because you're out with a customer and you're representing Cardinal Health, whether you pay for it out of your own pocket or you pay for it through an expense. So I think making sure you give real life examples like that, because it's very tempting when they know they're going to blow the meal limit to just pay for the bottle of wine themselves. At the end of the day, they get bonused on that sale, so they're going to get compensated for it. So they say it's a cost-benefit analysis worth doing. So it's very important to use those real-life examples.
Yeah, but it does highlight the challenge, I think, in a large extent. Now, I mean, UK Bribery Act and FCPA I don't know very many U.S. companies that have allowed facilitation payments for a lot of years, mostly because even before the UK Bribery Act, it was such a narrow exception, a lot of companies were getting in trouble over it. So I certainly wouldn't try to do some nuanced legal analysis to try to permit you to try to find a way to use facilitation payments or take advantage of the differences between UK and FCPA, mostly because fundamentally what we're trying to do is build a culture of people that do things the right way. And as soon as you start to get too technical with any of these kinds of compliance laws, you start to risk the fact that you care more about winning business and finding creative shortcuts to it than you do about actually getting compliance and getting a good fundamental culture. But it is a real challenge in trying to manage in some of the countries the smaller types of bribes where people are going to kind of pay for it themselves. So one area though that is an area that you should check, and we do, is checking the salaries of the employees in some of these countries. Checking, for instance, the purchases within your getting the discounts within your store? Are you seeing one person in a region for some reason taking advantage of the company's store and buying hundreds of expensive devices at the discount? There's two different things they're doing there. One is they could be using those devices as bribes. Secondly, they very well could just be reselling them on eBay for their own profit too, which both are against our policy and I'm sure most of your policies as well. But it's a good point. It's very hard when things get completely taken off the books. As long as you've got a good culture, somebody's probably seeing something, and you hope that people will raise it if they see it.
So Kris, talking more internally now, how do you collaborate within your broader compliance and risk and audit teams to monitor and track the effectiveness of a program?
Sure. I mean, that's a constantly sort of evolving area. I mean, I think from the anti-corruption space, so what are we trying to do? And this is going to bring it a little bit back to MetricStream. I spoke a little bit earlier about the automation process we're trying to do. And what we're trying to do in the anti-corruption space, and Hollie, maybe you can speak if it's any different for you, we've always had the guidelines, right? The third parties that are considered high risk, you got to come to compliance and do the background checks. From my perspective, that there's always been both an over-inclusiveness and an under-inclusiveness to that. And what I mean by that is that on the one hand, I never had full faith that we were actually getting everybody to come forward. We've got a huge business in a lot of different regions, and although we had our set criteria of what is a high-risk intermediary or a high-risk third party, just never had the full confidence. And unfortunately, it was always my legal colleagues that I had the least confidence in, because they'd get busy and they would move forward and they'd be hiring a lawyer in a high-risk country, and we weren't doing the background checks. So I always didn't feel like we were quite getting there. On the other side, I felt like in order to try to get as broad and have as clear guidelines as possible, we were wasting our time doing diligence on companies like Dell Computers just because they did business in high-risk countries and we sold it to their high-risk regions. And so what we've tried to do is we're now trying to revamp that. We're tying directly into our financial systems, our onboarding process with procurement, our onboarding process with Salesforce, and we're using MetricStream to pull it in and ultimately now do an automated due diligence. And what I mean by that is we all have a set criteria. There is no reason why a human should have to pay attention to what country is being used and who the third party is, and to do some form of a background check with a service like Dow Jones or some of the others that are out there. So we're going to use this automated system to try to give us a clear set of approvals. We're working with procurement on that. We're working with sales. We're working with finance. We're working with HR and legal, all to try to get this system up and running so that our automated system will start focusing my team more on the actual third parties that are of a risk. And once we kind of escalate and narrow it to those high-risk third parties, that's when they'll go and they'll do the much more intensive due diligence, either sending it out to an enhanced due diligence provider or to do it internally. But that's sort of one way that we're starting to try to work with other groups and try to use kind of data and automation to our benefit.
Yeah, so our OUS compliance program is really pretty new. So we propelled into 70 different markets in the last 3 years. And so we were primarily a US-based company with a distribution business in China. But then about 3 years ago, we acquired the cardiovascular unit of J&J called Cordis. And then we are now in the integration of Medtronic's patient recovery business. That was a $6 billion acquisition that has also put us in the OUS markets. So we've been frantically building our program. And one of the things that I've done is, I created a cross-functional team of everyone from finance, procurement, customer setup to do a controls committee is what I call it. And we're looking at everything from how we're doing T&Es, do we have Concur launched? If we have Concur launched, what are we auditing? Does it make sense what we're auditing? And really bring in a lot of different perspectives to the table so that we can kind of start to tackle the various control points and put the risk there. So I think bringing these cross-functional teams together and having standing committees where, if we have a case, we do a case study on that. Where were the control gaps? What do we need to do? Do we have this gap somewhere else? So that's another way to bring in different viewpoints.
So, and that kind of goes with continuous development and regular review of your anti-corruption framework. Are there any recent innovations that you have done in this space, the anti-corruption space?
Innovations. Well, we are, most people who have a large third-party network have some type of, control monitoring process. So we're launching SecureMate. Now we've been using Thomson Reuters and Dow Jones, but now we're also trying to build a database, a software platform where we can monitor when's the last time we did training for a distributor, is the contract current, what's the last time we audited that distributor. So we're building that database so that we can track the hundreds of distributors that we just inherited. So.
And I'm just going to add, because I kind of talked a little bit about the innovation we're working on. Something we probably haven't mentioned well enough yet is there really are very few companies that are all the same size with the same risks, with the same issues. And so I've gone to a lot of these conferences over time, and sometimes you walk out and you think, holy cow, these companies are doing things that are way much further than I've even come close to having the resources for. And to the extent that you're in one of those companies, so my last company was almost the same size as this company that I work for now. I have a team of 30 people. There I was one. And so I'm very appreciative of those who may not have the resources to do everything that they may want to do. I think what you really want to do in those situations is go back to the sort of keep it simple. If you don't have the resources to come up with some new, innovative, fun and interesting anti-corruption technology or to do something like that, just get back to the basics where you really focus on the culture, you focus on the training, you focus on getting your management team and your middle management and all the way down to the front line to buy into this culture, that it actually makes them feel good to do the right thing. Get the incentives within the company working so that there are incentives for doing the right thing. And if you do that, all the fancy tools in the world are never going to do as well as that program at its base. You'll still have risk for sure, but you'll certainly mitigate a significant amount of it.
I would also say really focus on what your business cares about and how compliance can bring value to them. So a lot of times your compliance initiatives align with their cost savings initiatives. So I've worked very hard to show the value of compliance to the leadership team by aligning some of my priorities with reducing spend, because that's where we are right now as an organization. We want to reduce frivolous or unnecessary spend. So one of the first things I targeted was to bring transparency into our charitable donation process. Leadership had no idea how many charitable donations the company was providing outside of our core platform. And to show them the millions of dollars that was going out the door, and I wanted to take the decision rights away on charitable donations away from the sales force. And they're like, go fast. And we reduced that spend dramatically. We have that in other areas too with T&E, showing them T&E violations. That gets them all worked up because they're like, people are blowing money they shouldn't be blowing. But it also aligns with my compliance initiatives of making sure that we control how people are getting money out of the company. So thinking about how you can show value to the organization by bringing transparency to spend and also reducing compliance risk. And then real quick, going back to the basics, it's really hard to catch some of this fraud, but one of the best things you can do is just have your hotline, right? Your hotline is where you usually catch these people. People get jealous of other people, they get passed up for promotions, or they just want to do the right thing and they know someone's not. And most of these cases that you are successful in finding come through anonymous tips on your hotline. So making sure, like one of the first things I did is I want the posters in every single facility. We had no good source that showed all of our locations around the world. And when we finally got it, it was over 300. And we made a project plan to make sure there was posters in every single facility, because that's where you're really going to catch it, is people calling your hotline. So make sure your posters are out there.
And I think we're approaching about 5 minutes left, but I do want to, just given the global geopolitical and regulatory cultural shifts and the anti-bribery and corruption programs have evolved, what do you see as the top trends and challenges for the anti-bribery and corruption programs 2018 and beyond.
So I'll start first. So really hard in the anti-corruption space to look at politics and think that it's not important anymore. Unfortunately, you'll likely hear an executive say something like that. Everybody, the new sexy thing is privacy right now, so why do I need to continue to invest in corruption? Well, I mean, ultimately, the whims of politics should not and never should be the foundation of any kind of a program. So make sure you're continuing to put the business case that corruption matters. Corruption matters not just because one politician or one country or one group is either getting better or not. Corruption is going to be a risk that we're going to face. Certainly in my lifetime, just because there's too many incentives out in the world for it. So pay attention to that and make sure your program is agnostic to that. As far as sort of emerging trends, I talked a little bit about it earlier. I do think there's going to be a bit of a clash between privacy and corruption in terms of how you research and the kinds of databases and the kinds of evaluations that you do, certainly of individuals and consultants and other people, and the information that might be available out there for you when you do your due diligence and your background checks. So just be on the lookout for it. I don't think that really warrants too many changes other than just making sure that you are keeping a minimized amount of data on your databases, make sure that you're making sure everybody has notice of it, and it should go not just over your anti-corruption databases, but also your hotline and other databases, because the privacy laws are getting more and more strict, and they're only going to continue to do so.
I also would say that the government continues to add investigative resources in the Department of Justice and the SEC to combat foreign corruption and corruption in general and fraud in general. So you're up against this environment where there's more and more investigators and prosecutors who are capable of taking these cases. And the other thing, we're seeing a lot in the press from the Department of Justice about voluntary disclosure and really encouraging companies to come forward with voluntary disclosure. I would just make sure that you talk with your outside counsel very carefully, because the Department of Justice is a different department than the SEC, and the SEC may have a different perspective than the Department of Justice on how they're going to treat a voluntary disclosure and what credit they're going to give you for coming forward.
Well, Hollie, Kris, thank you. The time is up. I think it went quick.
Yeah.
I want to thank everyone for joining as well, too. Wish we had time for more questions, but they'll be around the dinner tables.
Yep. And thanks for participating. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.